Hello, let's try this again. The next part of Colossus, The Price of America's Empire, and some thoughts on that. This time I'm leaving the garage door open so that I can work on my mentality as well. And someone might walk by and hear me. My gosh, instead of doing this in the middle of the night. Okay, so first steps. It is often assumed that the greatest failure of American policy during the Cold War was defeat in Vietnam. Yet the loss of much of Indochina to communist regimes proved to be as strategically unimportant as it was politically embarrassing. The United States lost face, that was about all it lost. It was the people of Vietnam and Cambodia who paid the horrifically high price of American failure. Americans themselves were able to walk away from the wreckage of containment. Okay, so it turns out that a lot of the communist regimes in Southeast Asia were communist accidentally. They were communist because that was the philosophy, because that was the economic rationale, because they were fighting against colonialism and not their own version of private property and independence. It is like Vietnam was a war for independence. It turned out that the Vietnamese didn't really get along with the Chinese, didn't really get along with the Russians as regards, the great giant communist danger. Instead, they were their individual countries, allied to each other, politically aligned perhaps, but not the same. You weren't facing the Red Scare. You were facing independence movements in small countries. And so it turned out that once Indochina became independent, that was it. It mostly stayed just another country, and not one that was ready and raring to go as regards invading. It turns out that the Soviet Union and its threat was pretty much the threat of Russian invasion, not the threat of communist invasion. Okay. And then if the Caribbean mattered only slightly, then the sub-Saharan Africa scarcely signified at all. By comparison with the one region in the world that by the early 1970s Americans could not possibly afford to lose, this was the Middle East. Look, we don't care if there's communist regimes growing up in the Caribbean or South America. Turns out very small, very weak countries. We don't care about it happening in Southeast Africa. Turns out very small, very weak countries. So it's an embarrassment. It's perhaps something you want to deal with, but it's not a threat to the Western world. Middle East, however, is a different beast. Middle East is how Russia breaks out of containment. And this, again, is something interesting, right? Many misconceptions, the book says, exist about the attitude of the United States towards the region. One is that the United States is actuated by an unconditional, unquestioning special relationship with the state of Israel. Another is that the United States has been drawn to the Middle East mainly by the existence of vast oil reserves beneath its desert sands. Still, a third is that the terrorist attacks of 9/11 were America's just desert for her misdeeds in the region. Such notions are by no means confined to the membership of Al-Qaeda. The fires had scarcely been quenched and the dust had barely begun to settle in lower Manhattan when a succession of folk rushed to give vent to similar theories in the press. The reality is a great deal more complicated. And this is where I want to sort of disagree on what's going on here. Okay, so first, America's relationship with Israel has long been characterized by friction and ambivalence. Well, yes, but it's never been a question if America would unilaterally decide to withdraw all its support. And when you're not going to withdraw your support, your influence is predictably weakened because you aren't actually willing to take the drastic steps you say you are. You're just fractious. And ambivalence can be positive or negative, right? Ambivalence in the sense that, well, yeah, sure, you're growing in the Palestinian territories and we should solve that problem, or you have military adventures going on in Lebanon, and we should solve that problem, and so on. But if you are protecting the country that is doing that, then it's not ambivalence so much as maintaining status quo. And if you maintain the status quo, then countries can take advantage of that. Why has Saudi Arabia become so much more important than Egypt over the past few decades? Because of their relationship with the United States. Egypt has millions more people. It has a much more important strategic position, but is less important because they haven't been quite as successful in siding with the US. Secondly, it says here, the oil-rich United States is much less dependent on Western oil than in Western Europe or Japan. And this is where it gets kind of interesting. It says, control of Arabian oil reserves is a goal the United States long ago renounced. If such control were really necessary to ensure the flow of oil to the Western world, it would be the oilless Germans and the Japanese who would be pressing for it with the greatest zeal. And like the question arises, why are we in the Middle East for the oil? Why does the United States care about the oil? And I think there's three general answers I would feel. I feel that tend to be the case. One, the United States is not as dependent on oil as the other countries, as Europe and Japan, for example, but it is still dependent on oil, and oil supply is guaranteed globally. That is, the prices are a matter of global oil supplies, not local oil supplies. So if the Middle East oil suddenly becomes cut off, then oil prices go up that the U.S. produces, but that also means that gas prices go up for the U.S. consumer. Not as dependent upon Arabian oil does not mean divorced from Arabian oil entirely. And secondly, there is a difference between control of Arabian oil and ensuring the supply of Arabian oil. The United States might not be all that interested or feel it necessary to control where the oil goes and how much is pumped out and so on, but it wants to ensure this oil can get somewhere. It wants to ensure that oil supplies are plentiful. It wants to ensure that there are oil resources going to China and Japan and Western Europe and South America and Africa. The United States can do this by itself to an extent, but it is cheaper, straight up, to get oil from Arabia. It's easier to pump out of the ground, and there's greater reserves and so on and so on. So just because the United States isn't completely controlling oil in the Middle East doesn't mean it doesn't have an interest in ensuring oil remains there, available. And thirdly, the phenomenon of terrorism in the Middle East and indeed elsewhere has until recently had relatively little to do with the United States. What was remarkable about 9/11 was simply that it had taken so long for a major terrorist outrage to happen on American soil. And what appears to have motivated the attackers could hardly be described as a misdeed, since American troops were stationed in Saudi Arabia primarily in order to defend that country and its neighbors from the aggression of another Arab state, Iraq. So this gets into a more complicated issue. Here, the pattern of U.S.-Saudi relations was already established. Cash and arms for the Saudi royal family in return for oil concessions and military bases for the Americans. When John Foster Dulles became the first American Secretary of State to visit the Middle East in 1953, he was impressed. The oil and other mineral resources of the region would, he declared, be vital to our welfare. Yet if the U.S. had really believed that, it would surely have acted very differently in one fundamental respect, for nothing could have been better calculated to alienate the Arab peoples and consistent support for the state of Israel. Well, it gets more complicated. Israel is not important for oil. Israel is the major military power in the Middle East. Israel has a very strong strategic position that you would think Egypt would have, but the issue, of course, is that Israel can beat Egypt senseless with one hand tied behind its back. And there are many, many reasons for this historically and politically and technologically and monetarily and so on. But the United States is a supporter of Israel precisely because of its military power. As well, you can say that support for Israel would alienate the Arab peoples, but it does not mean that that would alienate the Arab governments, right? They may not enjoy Israel, but unless you are literally Lebanon or Jordan, you may not have much of a beef with them. If you're Saudi Arabia or Kuwait or Egypt, then you make your peace with the major military power and you keep going, doing whatever you want. The Palestinian issue is not something that actually concerns the majority of governments as regards power plays, right? Because the Palestinians don't have political or economic or military power. The Israelis do. And this is saying what was the phenomenon of terrorism in the Middle East has until recently had relatively little to do with the United States. And to an extent, this is true. Right, to an extent, in that the United States was not directly involved in all sorts of activities. There's a reason that terrorism struck at Europe well before it struck the United States. There's a reason that terrorist groups exist in the Middle East because of the weaknesses of their local governments, because of the vast land areas, because of the hills and the terrain, because of the low level of money or the backwardness of the economy and so on and so on. But to say the United States has had little to do with it is also a bit of a misnomer. The United States may not have directly acted to cause so much of the issues that terrorists before 9/11 at least, were so anti-American about. But what the United States did do was support various regimes. So if you are a terrorist and you are in Saudi Arabia and you don't like the Saudi Arabian government, and you are in Kuwait and you don't like the Kuwaiti government, and you are in Iran and you don't like the Iranian government, you are in Iraq, you don't like the Iraqi government, you're in Egypt, you don't like the Egyptian government, you're in Morocco, you don't like the Moroccan government. You have incentives to do your terrorist acts in that country, but you are much more likely to be effective, right, if you have support. And how do you get support? Well, you have to make other people think that they should fight against your country, right? If you're Saudi Arabian, if you're Egyptian, if you're Moroccan, if you're Afghani, if you're Pakistani, if you're Turkish. And how do you do that? How do you get support? Well, you're going to get support from one of two areas, right? Either it's going to be support from an extraterritorial state, a la Iran's going to give money to Hezbollah, for example, because it caused problems with Israel, because they want to cause problems with Israel. So you have an enemy in common. If you are in Saudi Arabia and you don't like the Saudi Arabian government, well, you're going to have common cause with the enemies of Saudi Arabia. The other way to get support is to not attack Saudi Arabia directly. You say, we're going to attack America. We're going to attack the Great Satan. We're going to attack the United States because they're behind this. And then you can point at Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Morocco and Turkey and say, look, America's supporting all of them. We could fix the Middle East entirely if we just attacked the Americans. What? Because you can't unify all the folk around attacking Saudi Arabia or attacking Iraq. You can unify them or unify your various supporters by a push against a different enemy, one who is happily not involved in your daily life, right? Now, instead of blaming the police or your own politicians, you can blame the Americans because they're the ones making sure that these police and politicians stay in charge. If the Americans weren't interfering, then we would have a different government and it would be better, of course. That's not necessarily the case. If the Americans were interfering, you might have a different government, or your government might be more oppressive, or the government that replaces it could be worse. You don't really know. It's proving it counterfactual again. It's just assuming the Americans make things worse. Although the Americans do sometimes make things worse. And that's how a lie travels around the world. It contains a hint of truth. And it goes on here, about he goes on about how the United States disagrees with Israel and so on. It says, what is less frequently noticed is how often Israel and the United States have disagreed. Truman's support for Israel did not extend to military assistance, for example. Dual suspended aid to Israel on more than one occasion. The United States was hostile when Israel occupied Sinai and the Gaza Strip in 1956, insisting the Israelis withdraw. It failed to ensure freedom of passage for Israeli shipping through the Strait of Tiran on the eve of the Six-Day War, despite having pledged to do so at the United Nations. Later, the United States favored the internationalization of Jerusalem and expressed criticism of Israeli policy of colonization, the territory captured from the Arabs in 1967, and so on and so on. And then it says, what really drew the United States into the Middle East in the 1950s was not Israel or oil, but fear of the Soviet Union. To be precise, fear that the Russians would be able to capitalize on the crisis of American empires as successfully in the Arab world as they had done in the Asian. And we get into why did America enter the Middle East in the first place? Because of Russian aggression. Because it was one empire, the United States hegemony at least, the Western world trying to contain the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union had only a few ways out. You could go into Asia, and it turns out Asia is really poor, really backwards, and you've still got walls in Korea and Japan and the Philippines, and you hit a brick wall, essentially, as regards the expansion of Asia. And it turns out that when the communists extend into Asia, they wake up the specter of China again, which enters the modern world and is strong enough to resist Russian suggestions, whereas some place like Poland is not strong enough to resist Russian suggestions about how it should act. And then you get into Indochina, and it turns out you hit a brick wall again because it's a bunch of islands, and you run into Australia, and there's nowhere to go and expand, and you have independence movements that are coming out, and then the United States has relationships with Thailand, for example, and India. It's hard to expand. You going to go west into Europe, and you hit a brick wall. You hit Germany, you hit Switzerland, you hit Italy, you hit the American nuclear umbrella. You can't go north because it's a frozen wasteland of Antarctica, and climate change hasn't yet opened up much of the area for expansion. So the only other direction the Russians can go is south, is the Middle East. So the war over containment actually ends up happening in the Middle East. Because if the Russians can break into the Middle East and take over the Arabian Peninsula or take over the Holy Land or take over Egypt or take over Afghanistan and Iran, then they gain access to what the Russian government has wanted for 400 years, a consistent warm water port. They gain access to the seas and the oceans. They gain access to the world. Instead of having to rent a base from the Syrians, you just own it outright. And yet it turns out that the Soviet Union can't conquer the Middle East. It invades Afghanistan. It tries to exert influence in the Caucasus Mountains, in Iraq and Iran and so on. But the Americans push back. They support the regimes already there, or support regimes are positive towards American interests. And so I don't think that you can say the Americans had nothing to do with terrorism. Part of the reason terrorism existed in the Middle East or grew up in the Middle East is because of the governments and issues there, is because of the push and pull between Russian and American influence. may not have we may not have directly caused terrorism in Afghanistan, for example, but by supporting Mujahideen there for 15 years against Russia, we funded and trained them. So again, we are partly at fault. It's just our own issues coming back to us. But again, it's partly at fault, not entirely. And this gets interesting here. In 1956, Nasser's flirtations with the Russians and grandstanding appeals to the rest of the Arab world had irritated Eisenhower and Dulles so much that they resolved to call his and Khrushchev bluff. The American refusal to finance Nasser's projected Aswan Dam prompted another spectacular nationalization, this time of the Suez Canal. If, at this juncture, the United States had been able to control what were supposed to be two of its closest allies, Britain and Israel, things might have turned out quite differently, not only in the Middle East. Instead, the British Prime Minister Anthony Eden agreed to a harebrained French scheme to reoccupy the Suez Canal zone by force on the pretext of stopping an Arab-Israeli war the Israelis were happy to arrange. Incredulously, Eisenhower asked, how can we possibly support Britain and France if in doing so we lose the whole Arab world? Unfortunately, Khrushchev's public threat to use nuclear weapons appeared to be the reason for the Anglo-French withdrawal, whereas in reality it was a disastrous run on Sterling and the American refusal to lend Britain assent until Eden agreed to pull out. Thus, the United States got no credit in Cairo for pulling the plug on Eden, and just 2 years later found itself unable to do anything when, at Nasser's instigation, a group of Iraqi officers staged a revolt in Baghdad that toppled and murdered the pro-British Hashemite monarch Faisal II and his Prime Minister Nuri Said. Not long after the coup, the new Iraqi government revoked the Iraqi Petroleum Company's concession. Iraq was among the first Arab countries to nationalize its oil industry. Meanwhile, the Saudis halted their arms purchase from the United States and declined to renew the lease in the Dhahran air base. Unlike Castro in Cuba, Nasser had little interest in the Soviet economic model, but he too was happy to collect such bounties Moscow had to offer and to jeer derisively at Washington. So what this whole story is about basically is, look, the Middle East has its own problems and it is its own fault. There are influences from the Russians and the Americans which did not help this situation, and you have the ongoing history of colonialism, British and French interest in the Middle East causing trouble, and you have essentially dictators who get their feelings hurt and cause all sorts of problems. Because if one person is in charge, that creates a very powerful state that can act very fast, but it also creates a state which can make horrific mistakes. And so you have America trying to sort of balance all its allies in different directions, saying just stop fighting. Like America, again, the United States of America would be just perfectly happy if everyone would just stop fighting. We're just like, oh my God, stop hitting each other, you stupid idiots. Just get along and it would be fine. Unfortunately, that's not how the world works. People like to hit each other. People like to hit themselves sometimes. And so you have Israel interfering, and you have Britain and France interfering. You have Egypt trying to unify the Arab world and failing. You have Saudi Arabia trying to push back against Wahhabism and its own internal terrorist problems. You have Afghanistan becoming a hotbed for terrorism. You have Iraq pushing terrorism around the planet. You have Iran just causing trouble. And the United States can go in and squash any one of these bugs at any time if it wished, but it can't not squash all the bugs all at the same time. And if it does go in and squash a bug, if it does go in and overthrow Iraq, for example, well, then it wants to get out. But it turns out if you get out, then the entire place just dissolves into civil war, which is a hotbed for terrorism again. And guess what? This ends up eventually hurting the interests of the United States or the interest of Europe or the interest of Japan or the interest of our allies. And meanwhile, Russia or the Soviet Union or whoever, or China or whatnot, is standing back going, hey, we can take advantage of this opportunity to exert our influence. And now you got to deal with an empire that is just like your own, where China or Russia don't directly rule Belarus, don't directly control Mongolia, but also those countries aren't doing much unless, their big brother allows them to. The United States, meanwhile, has a different problem. It can guide, it can suggest, it can say this or that, but at the end of the day, if a country wants to go its own way, a la Israel, the United States has only two options. Either you pull out or you stay in. And as this book notices, at least as in regards Israel, this causes problems. By the end of the 1950s, three things were already painfully obvious about America's position in the Middle East. First, the Israelis regarded U.S. support as having, to all intents and purposes, no strings attached. Secondly, the American oil companies were as vulnerable to the British stake in the Suez Canal nationalization by Arab governments, but no very obvious incentive to share the rents from their oil with foreigners. Thirdly, peaceful coexistence between Israel and its Arab neighbors was unlikely, if not impossible. The good news from an American standpoint was that Soviet penetration in the Middle East proved to be much less successful than might have been expected in 1958. The bad news was that there arose, in the wake of the Arab-Israeli wars, a more dangerous, or at least less predictable threat than Soviet penetration. This was terrorism, the original sin of the modern Middle East. When Zionist extremists had once done to drive the British out of Palestine, Palestinian extremists now into Israel's once their hope of an Arab military victory had been dashed. So the one interesting thing about terrorism, it is ineffective. It is extremely, incredibly, undeniably, and obviously ineffective. It takes 20 years to push a regime one way. You have massive economic problems caused by terrorism. You end up hitting your own people and destroying your own country and tearing apart your own tribe. And if you finally, when you end up with Afghanistan, you got a poor country no one wants to talk to. And you still got problems because you're newly independent and you don't have a long history of peaceful coexistence. You have a long 20, 30, 40, 50-year history of very warlike coexistence. You're just the Scottish clans again, only unifying when an outside force comes to attack you, and then occasionally raiding over the border. This is the world we live in, right? All the terrorists in the world, if they got together, would amount to a few 100,000. And they formed an army, would have no chance whatsoever of actually overthrowing the government of Israel or Britain or France or Turkey or Saudi Arabia or China or the United States or Colombia, right? They simply don't have the economic and military power to do so. What they have the ability to do is to cause chaos and trouble, to gradually and slowly weaken these countries over time until eventually they fall apart under the weight of their own internal pressures. Right? And some countries have fewer internal pressures than others. One thing the Soviet Union was very good at was straight up just killing people who caused internal problems. One thing China is very good at is just straight up grabbing people who cause internal problems and internal political stress and tossing them in jail so they're never heard from again. One thing the United States is very, very bad at is doing any of that. One thing that Britain or France, for example, is very bad at is controlling its populace and making sure that you don't have splinter movements growing up and strange political movements and so on. Now, there are benefits to this. This means the United States is in a constant state of change. This means that Britain, for example, is constantly evolving and shifting, and it does so very, very slowly. So the Britain of 2050 is not the Britain of today and is not the Britain of 1950. And it does all this with continuity of governmental control. So that's the ideal of democracy, at least, right? You may have your internal pressures, and so instead of clamping down on these internal pressures, you release them and accept the shift and change. The opposite action is something that like China does. You have their internal pressure and you clamp down and you clamp down and you clamp down, and maybe you clamp down for long enough, the pressure goes away, it bleeds away. You fix all the problems and so on. The other possibility is that you clamp down on this pressure for so long that eventually it explodes and you get something like the Russian Revolution. You get something like the breakup of the Soviet Union, massive disturbances. You get something like the Venezuela, where millions of people are fleeing the country because you didn't change fast enough, but you also weren't strong enough to keep your country together and peaceful. This is the question that arose as regards China, especially during the Maoist era and afterwards. Was China strong enough as a government to clamp down on internal dissension? It turns out that it was. That the idea that the Western world had as regards China when it began opening up after Deng Xiaoping was that China would eventually change its ways by entering the modern world, that private property would begin to exert a political influence in China strong enough to result in the gradual overthrow or the gradual shifting of method, perhaps, of the Chinese government. This did not happen. It turned out that the communists were able to clamp down on burgeoning political movements, or at least they have been so far. And now we get back to Israel again. Okay. Now we got the 1948, we have the Six-Day War, 1967, and so on. The Israelis just beat everybody up. Once again, the Arabs were easily beaten. Okay, Nasser had explicitly pledged to wipe Israel off the map. Once again, the Arabs were easily beaten. Once again, the Israelis occupied Sinai and Gaza. And now they also, in response to the Jordanian decision to join the Egyptian side, they took Judea, including Jerusalem and Samaria, as well as the Golan Heights. The Yom Kippur War in 1973 ended up as another botched attack on Israel by Egypt and Syria. Even with Iraqi and Soviet assistance, the Arab armies were driven back to their own territory. By 1982, the Israelis felt confident enough to invade Lebanon. And in their response to these external threats, the Israelis felt under no obligation to consult the United States. The Americans were not warned about the Six-Day War. As Nixon commented in an interview in 1970, the Middle East had become terribly dangerous. It is like the Balkans before World War I, where two superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union, could be drawn into a confrontation that neither of them wants because of the differences there. Like, the United States wants Israel to back the hell off. The United States wants all the Arab countries to back the hell off and deal with their squabbles politely. The United States pushes for this. You look at the issues between India and Pakistan. The reason we haven't had a nuclear war between India and Pakistan so far is at least partially due to U.S. influence, saying, stop fighting, you stupid idiots. Just work together. It turns out they can't do that. Same with the Israelis and the Arabs. They just can't work together. They don't agree to it. If Israel wanted actual peace, then it would allow for the creation of Palestine. It's like, we're going to create Palestine, and these are the rules, and ding, 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 ding. We're going to accept these issues, and Palestine's going to be independent, or it's going to be a UN-controlled Palestine, or the U.S. is going to take control, or anything, except the Israelis are intent on the genocide action, right? And it's not a fast one. It's not throwing people in gas chambers. It is slow and sure and dedicated, and it happens over the course of generations. You just keep pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing, with that pressure, until eventually either the pressure explodes and you get another war, a la the Gaza issue today, or the pressure slowly disappears and you get something like the West Bank, where Palestinian political and economic and military adventures are so incredibly weak that Israel can just build settlements wherever it wants, and no one's stopping it. Okay, so why is no one stopping it? Essentially, right, America supports Israel because it's militarily important, right? Because in the 70s, you got Egypt trying to side with the Soviet Union. You're pushing back against these bits, and you're going, okay, if we don't support Israel will be supported by the Soviet Union. Okay, and then in modern days, in 2001, 2004, you go into the Middle East, and you're going, okay, well, we're invading Iraq, and we have a lot of forces in Iraq, and we're also trying to contain Iran, and Israel is an enemy of Iran, so we'll just ally with Israel militarily, and so on and so on and so on. It makes perfect military sense. The issue, of course, is this line here. Okay. So the United States is supporting a UN resolution condemning Israeli occupation of the Golan Heights. The United States condemns the actions of the Israelis in the Six-Day War, condemns the actions of the Israelis as regards the settlements in the West Bank, condemns the actions of the Israelis as regards the Gazan War. But at the end of the day, this line here, the Americans never contemplated a complete break with Israel. And so Israel says, what the hell are you going to do, man? Israel does whatever it wants, and the United States may condemn, it may suggest, it may raise angry words, but it has no actual intention of leaving its military alliance with Israel behind. There's no actual intention of condemning Israel in a material matter, and so Israel has essentially carte blanche. Because unless the United States is willing to walk away from an agreement, then the other side can do whatever it wants. It's the same with any agreement you have with a person, with any alliance, right? The idea is you make an alliance with someone and you agree to act in concert. You agree to act together. And the idea of doing this is that you can control what your opponent does, at least, or you can control what your ally does, right? Because if your ally is just walking off willy-nilly, then you end up with Germany and Japan, who have no real reason to ally, except that they're tangentially fighting the same Europeans, but in totally different theaters and parts of the world, right? There's no actual reason for Japan and Germany to ally in World War II. There is no practical reason whatsoever. Japan could have declared war on French and British interests in the Indo-Pacific and had no need whatsoever to involve Britain, to involve Germany in this decision. The United States can push back into the Soviets, doesn't need to involve Britain, doesn't need to involve, oh my gosh, why am I saying Britain? Doesn't need to involve Russia in this decision. The Soviet Union is fighting both of them, but is an enemy in common. And at least theoretically, there are supplies that can be sent back and forth. At least theoretically, you can make plans to attack the Germans together, or the Japanese together. But as far as the Germans and the Japanese are concerned, it's very hard to coordinate across the planet, especially using 1940s technology. But they do it anyway, and it turns out you can't actually control what your ally does. So it's an alliance of what? It's essentially a non-aggression pact, except the United States doesn't have a non-aggression pact with Israel, which would make sense. The United States has a mutual defense bit with Israel. Your enemies are our enemies. Our enemies are your enemies, and so on and so on. If you're not willing to walk away, then the other alliance can take advantage of that. Israel is an example here, but we could say the same thing about France or the Philippines or India. It's like, yeah, we're allied with you in a way, but also if you would just stop fighting. The United States does not control its allies directly. It influences, but it's not an empire. It's a hegemony. right? The Americans protested against the policy of settlement and about the use of lime ammunition against stone-throwing Palestinians, but to no avail. Of course, you're not actually willing to say you have done too much with these civil rights violations. We cannot be allied with you. Why? Because the United States has an alliance with Israel based on military matters, not anything to do with like the democracy of Israel. The democracy of Israel is of no concern whatsoever to the United States. It is Israel's friendliness. It is Israel's strategic position. It is Israel's technology and money. It's not about democracy in the Middle East whatsoever. That's a false flag. Unfortunately, the Americans are, people in the United States are addicted to saying we are not an empire, we are anti-imperialist, we are for freedom, we are trying to help people. Why? Because it turns out that's better for American interests than just straight up being an empire. America wants to be a different sort of empire. America wants to be an empire with a lot of very happy colonies, with a lot of very happy Commonwealth allies where we all work together and it's kumbaya, la-di-da-di-da. Unfortunately, it turns out that America has a bunch of allies who are squabbling 5-year-olds. It also turns out that America isn't very good at dealing with squabbling 5-year-olds because what we want to go and do is go into a country, smack the ruler upside the head, and say, get your act together, then get out. Unfortunately, when you do that, the ruler's head rolls off, and now you've got civil war in the country. Or now someone else steps in. And so this big daddy Soviet Union steps in and says, oh, I'm sorry, poor baby. The United States treated you so harshly. Well, we don't care about your civil rights violations. We just want military rights and so on. And we're not really going to overthrow your government. We're not really pushing a communist regime, but of course they are. Everybody lies, everybody hides. The United States has this dream, this idea of what it is, and then it consistently fails to achieve that dream. It consistently fails to actually say, we are an anti-imperialist empire, and we will stick by our guns. Instead, the United States is half an empire and half not an empire. It's an empire that doesn't want to admit it's an empire, and it's a non-empire that doesn't act like an empire. It's crazy. The United States it's schizophrenic. It is of two minds in everything it does. And this is most clear in the Middle East. So you have the Shah of Iran. The United States props up the Shah of Iran, overthrowing a legitimate government. And then is it no surprise that a government that decides to ally itself with Russia and the Soviet Union pops up in its place? I mean, the United States decided to help the Shah be put in power by military force, and military force overthrows him, right? Live by the sword, die by the sword. It's not a surprise. And like all revolutionary regimes, Khomeini's Iran was soon embroiled in a war with its neighbors. Saddam Hussein, fearing a pro-Iranian rising by his own country's Shiite population, decided to invade Iran in 1980. Kissinger's sardonic comment, a pity they can't both lose, reflected the dilemma the United States now confronted. In a feat of realpolitik that eclipsed even Kissinger's during the 1970s, the United States ended up giving assistance to both sides. Arms were secretly sold to Iran. Saddam, meanwhile, received substantial commodity credits, rising to more than $1 billion in 1989. Despite the fact that his forces not only used chemical weapons, but on one occasion attacked the American warship. So, in this sense, between Iraq and Iran, the United States is saying, go ahead, go at it. We'll support both of you fighting each other because you're both weakened and you're both not friends of us. So again, the United States doesn't directly control, doesn't directly say, you fight you. The United States just has to stand back and allow these two 5-year-olds to go at each other. And of course, nobody ends up winning. Hundreds of thousands are dead, and the borders of Iran and Iraq are mostly the same today. It was all for naught. There was no reason to do this. There was no fighting that pushed this to happen. It was two governments, one revolutionary, one ruled by a dictator who decided to fight. And the United States is going, oh my God, just get along. But even as that happens, the United States is pushing them into not getting along. Again, schizophrenic, of two minds. Okay. The logic of terror. Why did Osama bin Laden, himself a Saudi, only order 21 of his followers to hijack 4 planes and fly them into the World Trade Center? According to them, the United States has been occupying the Arabian Peninsula, plundering its riches, dictating to its rulers, humiliating its people, terrorizing its neighbors. The Americans are, despite the great devastation inflicted on the Iraqi people, the Americans are once again trying to repeat the horrific massacres. Third, they support Israel and Jerusalem. The best proof of this is in their eagerness to destroy Iraq, the strongest neighboring Arab state. Okay, so essentially, Osama bin Laden is saying we're attacking America because of internal squabbles in the Arabian Peninsula. We're attacking America because we can't actually do anything against the people who are actually who matter. We're attacking America because American influence is causing fighting in the Middle East. When on the other side, America is saying we're trying to calm down the Middle East. We just can't get these 5-year-olds to stop fighting one another. Who is telling the truth here? It's, again, you're of two minds. It's schizophrenic. The United States is trying to calm things down, but also not willing to walk away from Israel. The United States is trying to appease Iraq, and what does this result in? Iraq pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing. The United States is trying to contain Iran, and Iran is propping up terrorist regimes. And the United States is supporting the Saudis, but the Saudis are also having a proxy war in the Sudan with the Yemenis or something. And it's just a giant mess. The United States, it goes into Afghanistan and Iraq, and it still can't control the fighting. It can't stop what's going on. And yet at the same time, it's not willing to simply walk away. And this is interesting to me because today, it seems much more clearly that we could walk away. Right? We could say, we don't need the damn Arabian oil. We got renewables. Right? Let's transition to wind and solar power completely so that we don't have to deal with the oil supplies of the planet anymore. It's just not our problem. The United States could say, well, we're going to get out of the Middle East and we'll let the Russians or the Chinese squabble over influence there, and they can spend the next 50 years dealing with the fights and the terrorism and the struggles. Right? Let the Islamic terrorists go after Moscow, for God's sake, instead of the White House. But the worry is that the Russians and the Chinese would succeed, would exert their influence and control these places. That they would end up supporting some dictator who did horrible things to his own people, and they would use that to exert their influence and expand and expand and expand. And now all of a sudden, you're dealing with an Afghanistan that's controlled by China, or an Iran that is controlled by Russia, or you're looking at the entire Arabian Peninsula deciding to ally itself with China and sending China cheap oil and sending them money and making trade agreements with them instead of the United States. And the United States is being left behind because you had these iron walls raised. And the United States wants to become friendly with all these countries, wants to trade with all these countries, and sometimes that involves, like I said last time, being involved with them. You can't get out. You can't just say, we don't have anything to do with you. It turns out the world is much smaller today. Right? Like, one of the worries in the Middle East is nukes. I think it's incredible how large the relation is between nuclear weapons and the activities of the United States. Why is the United States supporting Ukraine but not willing to put NATO troops in Ukraine? Because Russia has nukes. Why is the United States so anti-Iranian and so in support of the Israelis? Because the Israelis have nukes. And the Iranians are trying to get nukes. And the United States does not want nukes flying all over the planet. The United States does not want every tin pot little country on the earth deciding that it now needs nuclear capabilities in order to protect itself. Because that's how the world ends. That's how North Korea just gets in its head one day to launch an ICBM in Los Angeles. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, who knows? You want to control the spread of that right now instead of having to deal with a nuclear-armed state 50 years from now. What if Persia rises again, but now it's nuclear-armed? Well, it starts exerting its influence when you have the wars of empires again. You have a Cold War, you have proxy wars because they don't want to end up fighting each other directly, but eventually someone miscalculates. Eventually, Pakistan and India launch a nuke at each other, and now we've entered a new, terrible world where tens of millions can die at the push of a button, and instead of it just being hypothetical. Again, the United States, the primary goal of the United States is for countries to just stop fighting, for countries to be peaceful, for countries to be stable, because the United States grows its wealth by being a trading partner with all these countries. Unfortunately, the United States also has the idea that it should interfere, and this interference will make things calmer. Instead, it does the opposite. Okay. The aim of killing Americans was therefore clear. It was in order to liberate the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Holy and Mecca from their grip, in order for their armies to move out of all the lands of Islam, defeated and unable to threaten any Muslim. When in actual reality, all the holy places of the Muslim religion are already controlled by the Muslims. It's this dichotomy. It's this consistent. This is something that, as an American, you find you struggle with, right? America is constantly blamed for all these issues, and the average American is like, the hell do I have to do with this? Like, the hell did we do to Afghanistan to make them hate us? What on earth did we do to Iraq that we're called Iran that we're called the Great Satan? What the hell did we do? Well, it turned out we supported their enemies. It turned out that 30 years ago, the United States had some military adventure in their country, and they still remember it. The United States has a very different memory. The United States has a very short memory. This goes along with the United States' relation with its own power. Why do we send in the Marines and then pull them out? Why do we send in Marines, 13 times into Nicaragua in the space of 13 years? So we think this time we can fix it. And we're also of the idea that, like, I go to Vietnam and I'm like, okay, how do I think the Vietnamese will react to me? Are they going to dislike me because I'm American, because I've heard that? Or am I going to go and they're going to be like, oh yeah, that was 40 years ago. That was 50 years ago. And we're now happy to see you. You know, yeah, there was fighting, there was death, but that's just life. And this is what America ideally would do. Unfortunately, America is not always so great at that either. We want to say, all right, we had the Civil War, we had the Civil Rights Movement, and we finished it, we're done. 10 years later, it's all fixed. Instead, the old instances, the old history, the old foolishness keeps popping up again and again and again and again and again, and we can't get rid of it. And the average American growing up says, this is a new world, this is a new life, we can just leave it all behind. And it turns out we can't because of other people. It turns out we can't because we have our own ideas about what is supposed to be the case. It turns out we can't because there's institutional history. It turns out we can't because we have interests all over the planet. It turns out we can't because we would like to be able to trust that Syria, for example, is going to do what it says it's going to do, but we know it can't. We would like to be able to trust that Israel, when it agrees to a border being drawn with Lebanon, will stick to it, but it can't. We would like to trust that Iran will keep up its agreements with the nukes, but we can't. We would like to trust that China will hold itself to international trade law, but we can't. It turns out it doesn't happen. And the question, of course, on the other side, to ask the world is, do they think the Americans keep their word? Do we, as the United States, make an agreement and stick to it as long as the other side does? Do we have this contract relationship and we stay within the bounds of the contract, or are we always pushing and pushing and pushing? I simply don't know. Based on our previous history, it looks like we're pushing in all these broken up countries. But how do we deal with, for example, Britain and Israel and France and Saudi Arabia and Mexico? I have to look more at our particular history with those countries, because I can hear all sorts of claims all over the planet all the time about the Americans who are causing this trouble, and I'm just not sure that's really true. I mean, straight up, this claim here that Al Qaeda has the aim of killing Americans was to liberate the mosque, liberate Mecca. What the hell are you talking about? It's controlled by the Saudi Arabian government. Assad is controlled by. It's idiocy. It is directly contravening the facts of the case. It's just because we're supporting their enemies. We're supporting somebody they disagree with, and so now we become the enemy because they can't actually get themselves together to attack the people they want to. Or they're attacking the people they want to, and that violence just begins to spread and spread and spread until you have gangsters in the middle of Paris or in the middle of London recruiting local groups in order to attack Britain because Britain did something 40 years ago in the Middle East and people still remember it. The past rises up and seeks to destroy us. Right, terrorism has existed in the Middle East since the 1940s. Earlier than that. And then terrorism grows up, right? Terrorism is, however, a many-headed hydra. Though the PLO had been struck a severe blow by the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, the 1980s saw the emergence of new groups such as the Abu Nidal Organization, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Hezbollah, and Hamas. Whereas the PLO had owed more to nationalism and Marxism, this new generation of terrorism identified themselves primarily with Islam. What set their tactics apart from those in the 1960s and 70s was their resort to suicide bombing and their much greater readiness to attack Americans. Such has been the impact of the attacks of September 2001 that it is easy to forget that the number of international terrorist incidents has in fact been declining since its peak in the mid-1980s. Not only were Americans a target, they were also an easy target. Terrorism may not be new, but today's terrorists have astonishing advantages over their predecessor. Technology means that vast destruction can be inflicted at negligible cost, hence the rising number of casualties per attack. A Kalashnikov assault rifle can be purchased for a few $100s, the real cost of a nuclear warhead, are almost certainly lower today than any time since the Manhattan Project achieved its goal. The first bomb cost around $2 billion in 1945 dollars. Converted into prices of 1993, that figure rises tenfold, enough to buy 400 Trident II missiles. The fact that France could double its nuclear arsenal from 222 to 436 in 1991, while increasing its defense budget by less than 7% in real terms, speaks for itself. Yet Al-Qaeda needed nothing so sophisticated to destroy the tallest buildings in Manhattan, just flying lessons in box cutters. For $10,000 each, a trifling outlay of cash, a handful of men were able to kill 3,173 people and inflict immediate economic costs estimated at $27.2 billion. The demons of the past use the new technology of the future in order to destroy the present. And yet, as we have seen, the ideologies of the two entities bear certain resemblances to each other, but the military capabilities of Stalin, Khrushchev, and Brezhnev exceeded those of bin Laden by numerous orders of magnitude. An attack by the Soviet Union would have left hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Americans dead, and would have obliterated not 2 towers but multiple cities. The problem with Al-Qaeda is not that it is a big threat, it is that it is such a small and organizationally diffuse threat that it is exceedingly difficult to locate, whether to annihilate or to negotiate with. On one side, then, we have a powerful consensus that a man-made calamity like 9/11 must not be allowed to happen again. On the other, we have the sneaking doubt that avoiding such a repetition would be all but impossible. You can't control terrorism because there's no one to negotiate with half the time. Now, is such a diffusion of terrorism conceivable in the Middle East? Not, it seems clear, so long as Israel seeks a purely military solution to the problem. Nor, however, will terrorism in the Middle East cease so long as there are states willing to sponsor it. It should have been obvious long before September 2001 that the support of terrorist groups by Afghanistan, Cuba, Iraq, Iran, Libya, North Korea, Sudan, and Syria could be stopped only by intervention in those countries' internal affairs. Such interventions were far from easy during the Cold War, when any American action was certain to elicit a Soviet reaction. But even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, American policymakers found it hard to imagine doing more than meting out exemplary but largely symbolic punishments. In 1986, Reagan ordered airstrikes against 5 Libyan targets to teach Gaddafi a lesson about the practice of state-sponsored terrorism carried to high cost. In 1998, President Clinton launched missile strikes against alleged terrorist-related facilities in Afghanistan and Sudan in retaliation for the bombings of the American embassies in Kenya and Ethiopia. These demonstrations achieved little. Indeed, the image of a cruise missile hitting an empty tent seemed to symbolize American impotence. In the words of Clinton's successor, such tactics were simply a joke. So how do you stop terrorism when it is state-supported? Well, it turns out you stop terrorism that is state-supported by interfering in those states. You have to actually put boots in the ground and overthrow the government that supports the terrorists. Otherwise, you will never stop the terrorism. Because you need 5 men in a little cult group to destroy a skyscraper. The entire planet may be unified in disliking terrorism, but it turns out that you have enough wackos just in the United States alone to cause 100 terrorist activities, 100 bombings of Boston. All you need is 1 or 2 or 3 totally wacko people, so very angry or strange or hopeless or radicalized folk, in order to cause massive disruption of your entire society, because our society is so integrated now, right? The destruction of the bombing of the Boston Marathon killed an incredibly small number of people in relation to the size of the United States, but had an incredibly large effect because we all heard about it. We were all involved in it. 9/11 killed 3,000 people. Not that many. More people die every month because of car accidents than died in 9/11. But it was the symbolization. We all saw it. We all felt it. It was that effect on us. And so America invades Afghanistan and Iraq. America involves itself in these countries' internal affairs because they are involving themselves with American interests. And we're all doing this, again, in order to become rich and powerful, because trade is how you grow. Both sides. In October 1983, President Reagan ordered a full-scale invasion of the tiny Caribbean island of Grenada to reverse a left-wing coup. Success in Grenada was followed in Panama 6 years later, when George Bush Sr. ordered the overthrow of the dictator General Manuel Noriega. the United States is beginning to involve itself again. Significantly, the substantial increases in the budgets of these new military entities coincided with sharp reductions in the funding of the State Department. Never again would the generation of officers who had led the war effort in Vietnam quietly acquiesce in half-hearted warfare for half-baked reasons that the American people could not understand or support. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990, he thus unwittingly created the opportunity for the United States to inflict on him the treatment and just inflicting on Noriega. Yet for two crucial reasons, Iraq proved to be different. The first was a belief in 1990, which was almost universal in 1990, that intervention in the Middle East required the sanction of the United Nations. The second was that such a sanction, even if it were to be anonymous, would not be legitimate in the eyes of the stateless Islamo-Bolshevists. For America's victory in the Cold War had, in the ruins of distant half-forgotten Kabul, been their victory too. With the end of the Cold War, opportunities presented themselves to use America's reviving military power against one or more of these dangerous states that simultaneously threatened Israel, possessed oil, and sponsored terrorism. The question was not whether the United States would act against these sworn enemies. It could not afford not to. The question was whether it would do so alone or in partnership with its traditional allies. And I'll stop it here. Cover the next section, because it starts to get into history of Iraq and Afghanistan, which I'm not all that clear with. And I'm obviously getting worked up about this because I have this vision of America as an American, which says we are for truth and justice and peace, and what we actually want is for the world to stop fighting. And then it turns out that we're launching invasions. And then it turns out that if we don't launch invasions, there's fighting anyway. And it's unclear what the role of the United States should be. It's unclear what the role of the United States is going to be. It's unclear exactly what the United States wants. And it's extremely unclear if the United States is actually going to stick to a plan and hold on to it. So you have the two outcomes in Afghanistan and Iraq. Afghanistan, the Americans are out of there in a panic. In Iraq, Iraq is a functioning country today, mostly democratic. And then you have Israel. The United States may condemn Israel, but it's not actually going to do anything to stop it. You have Ukraine, where the United States supports the Ukrainians, but isn't actually going to put troops in there. Isn't going to, for example, close off shipping of oil supplies through the North Sea, through the Baltic Sea by Russia. Is going to actually turn the screws all the way. Instead, it sort of half-asses everything. Instead, it tries to put on pressure. Instead, it uses economic sanctions. And it's doing this partially because of the failures of full-out invasion. Partially because Russia has nuclear missiles and is threatened to use them. The United States isn't sure if it actually will or won't. Because it's, again, what is the world of the future? The United States would like everyone to get along, but would also like everyone to be on its side. Would also like everyone to follow rules which are beneficial for Americans. And America would also like to feel as if its life is getting better for itself. But instead you have internal American politics and economic problems causing worldwide issues. Why? Because it's easy to blame the foreigners when it's all our own faults. It's easy to blame our enemies when it's actually the issues we have with our allies. America's empire is of two minds, again, even today. And of at least two or three separate faces as well, I would say.